welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to share my top fiction books of 2022. So this is one of those annual videos that I really look forward to making every year. I love having a record of what my very favorite reads from the year were to look back on in the future, and it's always interesting to see if anyone else read the same books this year and to watch other people's favorite fiction reads of the year. So I did already do my favorite nonfiction reads, so I split my fiction and nonfiction because I just find it too hard to narrow down the list otherwise. But this is my top 10 fiction books from 2022. I'm going to start at the bottom, number 10, and work all the way up to number 1. So I'm sure this is already going to be a long video, so without further ado, let me introduce book number 10, which is The Appeal by Janice Hallett. This was a really fun mystery novel, and I think what especially drew me into this book was the format of the text, which is very multimedia. There's no actual narrative prose paragraphs of descriptive writing. Instead, it's all in the format of emails from characters to each other, text messages, meeting minutes, advertisements, newspaper articles, transcripts of voicemails, all that kind of thing. So the premise is that there are these two interns at a law firm who have been tasked with reviewing the evidence of a murder case that's gone to appeal. And so they are weeding back through the evidence to try to see if the original prosecutors missed anything that they could use to try to change the verdict. And the group of characters that we are kind of unraveling the lives of are a group of community theater actors who are putting on this play as a charity fundraiser for a young child that is related to one of the actors who is suffering from a rare childhood disease. So they're trying to raise money for this young child's charity appeal while also putting on a play. I found it to be a really gripping read, and it also takes a while to figure out who you can trust and who's being duplicitous with who, because you're seeing kind of the events unfold in real time through these text messages. So you'll be reading along and then you'll realize that one character is lying in that text message, or they're omitting information that they shared with someone else, and then you start trying to solve the case yourself. And it's kind of interesting because you don't actually know who was murdered until quite far into the novel, which also is kind of fun because you're also then not only trying to guess who did the crime, but also who was the victim of the crime, because there's numerous pairings of those two that are kind of make sense at different points of the book. Because of that multimedia format, even though it's a fairly long book in terms of page count, I found it to be a really quick read, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who enjoys fast-paced mysteries, or people who like true crime I think would also really enjoy this. Then book number 9 on my favorites of 2022 is The Hunchback of Notre by Victor Hugo. I listened to this 18-hour audiobook in 2 days, which I think shows just how absorbing I found the story. Even at 1.5 speed, that's pretty much non-stop listening for the time that I was awake and not at work. So I was pretty much just listening to this book and couldn't think about anything else until I'd finished the story. I read the Shorbell translation from 1833, which was narrated by Frederick Davidson, and it was a wonderful audiobook. I would highly recommend that audiobook narrator and that translation if you are interested in reading The Hunchback of Notre. And I kind of feel like I might be the only person in my generation who hasn't watched the Disney movie and so didn't really know the plot before going into this book. I feel like most people now who are reading this book have already seen the movie and have an idea of kind of what happens and what the main characters and major plot points, but I was pretty much going in blind, besides knowing that it is about a hunchback who lives in Notre Dame. I will say when I finished reading the novel, I did end up going to watch the movie because I was so curious to know how someone could turn such a dark and depressing book into a children's movie, and obviously there are some plot changes between the book and the movie, but it's still kind of a dark story for a children's movie. I think because I knew it was a children's movie, I wasn't expecting it to be quite so hard-hitting and depressing, especially at the end. I had kind of a variety of potential happy endings running through my mind as I was reading through to the conclusion, and then slowly got this sinking feeling as I realized it wasn't going to be a happy ending. Cathedral novels are actually one of my niche interests. I love reading any novel set in a cathedral, around a cathedral, during the building of a cathedral, or really where a cathedral looms almost as its own character within the story. Since The Hunchback of Notre Dame is kind of the original cathedral novel, I knew eventually I wanted to get to it, but it was kind of a bit of a whim that I picked it up when I did. It felt like a very autumnal book in my mind, even though I didn't know much about it, and it definitely didn't disappoint. Notre Dame de Paris is described so beautifully throughout the whole novel, and the different architectural elements of the church building end up taking symbolic meaning in the text as well that added an extra level of enjoyment to my reading of the book. This is my first Hugo novel, and I guess almost my first French classic. I've read The Black Tulip by Alexandre Dumas, but that is set in the Netherlands, so even though it's a French classic, it doesn't really feel like a French classic, so this felt like my first French classic, and it's definitely made me less intimidated to tackle other Victor Hugo novels. Les Miserables, obviously, sitting there on my bookshelf, is one that has always really intimidated me, but now that I've conquered The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it doesn't feel as overwhelming to pick up some of these other lengthy French classics, especially on audiobook. Book number 8 is Revelations by Mary Sharratt, and if you watched my 2023 historical fiction 5-star predictions TBR video, you'll already know that I really enjoyed this book a lot, and it's one that has made me interested in reading more by this author. This book is everything that I had hoped Matrix by Lauren Groff would be when I picked it up, and after not enjoying Matrix really at all, I was a little bit apprehensive about picking up Revelations, which I think made an even sweeter surprise when I did thoroughly enjoy it. And this book follows 2 Christian mystic women in the medieval period. We're really following the story of Marjorie de Camp, but Julian of Norwich also makes some honorary guest appearances throughout. One of the aspects of this book that I enjoyed the most is the descriptions of what life on the pilgrim path was in medieval Europe and in the Holy Land of the medieval period, because Marjorie Kemp makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which was very rare for a woman to do unaccompanied, and so that was just fascinating to read about. It definitely made me want to read the writings of both of these women that have survived up into the present day, and made me even more appreciative for the fact that we do have writings from these women about their mystical experiences that have survived to the present day, because throughout this book it was really clear how hard they had to fight to be taken seriously as women in the church in this time period. Then book number 7 is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, and there are a couple surprises for me on this list of top 10 favorites. There are a couple sci-fi books near the top that we'll talk about that were shocking. And then there's also 2 World War II historical fiction books on this list, which was very surprising to me because I thought I had kind of burnt out on that time period. In my teens, I had read a ton of historical fiction set during the Second World War, and I thoroughly enjoyed it at the time, and then they all started to blend together and be pretty repetitive. And then when I didn't enjoy All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, I think that's the title, it was really popular maybe, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, and when I read it and didn't enjoy it, I was like, that's it, I'm done with World War II historical fiction. Like, the genre is saturated. I don't really feel like picking up anything else set during this time period, and I haven't read any more historical fiction set during that time period since then. I did read Anne Frank's diary, but obviously that is nonfiction. So when I dipped my toe back in that time period this year, I was really surprised that 2 World War II historical fiction books are ending up on this top 10 list. So the first of those 2 is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This book is narrated by Death, which is a very unique literary device. I don't think I've ever read another book narrated by Death, or really a book narrated by, I don't know how to describe it, an outside figure in that way. So it definitely sets it up with an ominous tone right from the start. You know that Death is watching this girl and the people in her life. And we're following Liesel, who is a young girl growing up in Nazi Germany who becomes obsessed with collecting books, particularly books that she rescues from book burnings or other books that would be considered contraband if she was caught with them. And she is living with a foster family who ends up taking a Jewish man in and sheltering him in the basement. And then we kind of follow on events from there as things get more serious and the war starts to have more and more impacts on the lives of the people in this town. This is a book that I'd actually DNF'd in the past, but I always knew that I would want to circle back to because I've heard such good things about it, and for whatever reason when I picked it up this time it just clicked with me and I got really invested in these characters and their stories, and by the end I was absolutely sobbing through the last, 5 or 10 pages. It really had a heavy emotional impact. Then book number 6 is my other Second World War historical fiction novel, and that is Remote Sympathy by Chidgey. This book absolutely swept me away with just beautiful prose and a haunting story that's centered around the Buchenwald concentration camp and the German commander's wife who is seeking cancer treatment from a Jewish doctor who is imprisoned there. I really loved the unique style where we had 4 different characters and their voices represented in different formats. So there was one character whose story was told through imaginary diary entries, another was told through prison interview transcripts, another who was told through letters back to his daughter, and then the 4th section was the villagers who were in the town surrounding Buchenwald, and they were kind of given a Greek chorus-esque treatment. So it was really fascinating to have the story told cohesively but through these 4 different formats. This is a book that I really wish I could study with an English class or at least listen to a really good literature podcast analyze, because there were so many layers of metaphor and symbolism and meaningful literary fiction style writing throughout. This is probably on the more literary spectrum of the historical fiction that I usually enjoy, but sometimes it's really nice to have one of those books where instead of just getting swept up in the plot and flipping through the pages as fast as you can, you stop and really savor some sentences and are just like, wow, that's really beautiful writing. So I did write down many favorite quotes from this book, and I have one that I want to share, which is, "And at night the past ran its drowned fingers across my cheek," which I think is the most beautiful way to describe someone lying in bed crying, remembering better times in the past. The past ran its drowned fingers across my cheek. I just love it. I love it. So if you enjoy historical fiction but also really like beautiful writing and are willing to have a very sad story, there's no happy endings obviously, it's a concentration camp story, I would really recommend this book. Then we're halfway there. Book number 5 is Laurus by Eugene Vodolazkin. This is a book that I have been intimidated to pick up for a really long time. I heard about it on the Fountains of Carrots podcast, and I've seen it crop up in a few other places as a recommendation of a book that you consider to be a future classic, a book that is currently contemporary but you see having holding power to one day become a classic. So obviously as someone who loves classics, I'm interested to read books that people consider to be modern classics or have the potential to become a modern classic. But both the length and what I'd heard about the complexity of the plot had me scared to pick this up, and to be fair, with good reason. There were parts of this book that were a real slog, but it was definitely rewarding to read. Laurus examines so many universal human emotions, love, shame, regret, grief, but also has a lot of little plot elements that are specifically things that I find really interesting in books. It had a strong faith focus. There were aspects of it that were related to pandemics, and there was also a really strong thread throughout the entire book about how people live on in the memories of their loved ones after their death. This book is split into a number of sections that kind of detail different time periods and situations in Laurus's life, and for me the last 2 books really shone the most and definitely are what pulled it up into a 5-star top end of year favorites read for me. Those last two sections had so many quotes that I loved that Laurus definitely dominates my 2022 quote log. And I should warn people, if you're considering picking this book up, that the first few sections especially have some really serious and heavy topics discussed and described in a really gritty way, especially a serious trigger warning for infant death. It was really, really hard at times to read these passages, even as someone who hasn't been personally affected by those issues, so I can only imagine how much harder it would be if that was something that was personal to you. There's also a section earlier on where Laurus becomes a holy fool, and the book almost lost me at that point, and reading through the Goodreads reviews, I see a lot of people DNF'd it right around that point. It does become quite confusing. You're not really sure what's happening. No one's really making sense. He's meeting these people that are also holy fools and also aren't making sense, and you're just like really confused and wondering where the book is going. But like I said, the later parts of the book for me really made up for it, and also I guess kind of redeemed the parts in the earlier sections that I found challenging, because I could see the utility that the author was trying to gain from Laurus going through those experiences. So for me, I'm really glad I carried on through those difficult parts of the novel to get to the treasure, which is seeing Laurus's character arc fully unfold. Laurus reminded me of three of my other favorite novels of all time in the best possible way: Kristen Lavransdatter, The Old Drift, and The Canticle of Leibowitz, which we are going to get to later on in this video because it is my number 2 book. Spoiler. Like the Kristen Lavransdatter books by Sigrid Undset, this book has at its heart deep theological foundations and is really about a character trying to overcome and atone for mistakes they made earlier in their life. Like A Canticle for Leibowitz, the author weaves monasticism throughout this book, as well as kind of playing with the cyclical nature of time. There are kind of almost elements of not quite time travel, but there's some interpolation of time is what I'll say. And then like The Old Drift and like Remote Sympathy, there is almost a Greek chorus element to it, where interposed throughout Laurus's story we are getting these elements of kind of magical realism, where we are seeing his impact on people's lives throughout time. Then coming in at number 4 is The Last Painting of Sara de Vos by Dominic Smith. This is a book that I had picked up for my Reading Through My Family Tree Dutch Golden Age TBR, and it is a triple timeline novel. You're going to see a theme here. I think the next 2 books on this list of favorites, so these 3 in a row here, are all triple timeline books. In this book, The Last Painting of Sara de Vos, we are following Sara de Vos, who is a female painter during the Dutch Golden Age. We are following Ellie and Martin in 1950s New York, who cross paths when Ellie is hired to paint a forgery of a painting that has been in Martin's family for generations. It is the Sara de Vos painting. And then finally the plot kind of comes to a climax in the year 2000 in Australia at an unveiling of an art exhibit on female Dutch Golden Age painters, which is the pinnacle of Ellie's career in art history. I listened to this on audiobook, and it was one of those books where as soon as I finished listening, I really wanted to get my hands on a physical copy so I could reread it and annotate it, and also go to Goodreads and immediately mark everything Dominic Smith has ever written as one to read. This is a book I would recommend for fans of The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel or Girl with a Pearl Earring by Tracy Chevalier. For people who have fallen down that rabbit hole of watching hour-long art restoration videos on YouTube. For anyone who's ever touched the stones of an old building and imagined the hands that have also touched that wall in the past. For the sort of person who gets emotionally attached and roots for the villain in heist movies. And for anyone who stands a little too close to paintings in art galleries and almost triggers the security alarm, bending forward to really view every brushstroke on the canvas. I don't want to say too much more about the plot of this book because it's hard to describe how it's all connected without spoiling things, and it's really just a beautiful journey to go on from start to finish. And we're into the top 3. So coming in at number 3, and the only book that I have a physical copy of, is Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This is the 3rd book in what is kind of a very loosely connected trilogy that started with Station 11 and continued on with The Glass Hotel. You definitely could read this book as a standalone, but it would mean so much more if you had read the other 2 before coming to this one. There are a couple characters that make a cameo appearance, and even though all 3 books are standalones, they connect together so beautifully that I really do recommend reading it as a trilogy. My reading experience of Station 11 and The Glass Hotel were so phenomenal that I went into this book with sky-high expectations, almost scared to start because I was worried, like, can it live up to my own mental hype? And it did. This is also a triple timeline book, so we have a timeline that is 1912 Vancouver Island. There is a storyline set on a moon colony in the year 2200, which has I think a little bit of an autobiographical character for the author, who is an author writing a pandemic novel and on a book tour of Earth when a pandemic hits. And then a detective in the 2400s who's also partially living on this moon colony and comes to Earth to investigate the theory that Earth is a computer simulation. Similar to the other 2 books in this trilogy, Sea of Tranquility has a lot of non-linear storytelling where we're kind of looping around from character to character from time to time, and slowly by the end of the novel it all comes together into one beautiful picture. This book caused a little bit of a bookworm crisis for me and made me reconsider my stance against picking up any sci-fi. I had previously pretty much written off the genre as just something I wasn't interested in. And then when I loved this book so much, and like reading the descriptions of life on a moon colony was so poignant, I was like, wait, would I maybe like sci-fi? So you'll see this has kind of triggered a chain reaction where I am slowly starting to investigate different sci-fi authors and different sci-fi books and trying to figure out if there is a niche of that genre that actually I might really click with. So obviously coming in at number 3, I really enjoyed reading Sea of Tranquility, and I'm grateful to it for kicking off my journey into sci-fi. Then coming in at number 2 is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr., and this is the other sci-fi title on my favorites list. So if you told me at the end of last year that my 2022 favorites would include 2 sci-fi novels, I would never have believed it. But here we are. Absolutely loved A Canticle for Leibowitz and can't recommend it highly enough. This is yet another triple timeline novel. I'm seeing a theme in my favorites that I hadn't really clicked until I started compiling all my favorites, and it's like, wait, there's a lot of triple timeline books. This maybe is an element that I really like. But this is a triple timeline novel that is centering around the cyclical nature of the rise and fall of civilizations and what that means for humanity, and it's all centered around a monastery in the American desert following the destruction of society by nuclear war. The order of monks that lives in this monastery has been tasked with preserving the knowledge from the previous civilization by finding and copying any pieces of writing that they can find, and these little scraps of writing are called the memorabilia, and often they don't really know what they're copying, but they're just copying it down for future generations, hoping that at some point people will come along who can interpret this and make some sense of it. So basically, after the nuclear war, society turned on education and turned on science as being really negative because they blamed the scientists and the intellectuals for creating nuclear weapons. So in retaliation, kind of society turned on them and destroyed the vast majority of written materials. So these monks have some books that were smuggled into the monastery, as well as anything that they can find in like scavenging missions. So the first part of the book is set in the 26th century and is kind of roughly mimicking the medieval period. The next section is in the 32nd century and is based off of the Renaissance. And then the third timeline, the third section, is in the 38th century, and in this section civilization is back on the brink of nuclear disaster and in the middle of a Cold War. I found Miller's writing to be really beautiful and haunting, but also funny. It was a really interesting mix of, you know, reading passages and pages where you'd be really touched by what you were reading, and then having something that was laugh out loud funny on the next page. This book and this author have kind of an interesting story. It was written in the 1950s in kind of the height of the Cold War and nuclear fears, and it was really based off of the author's guilt for being involved in bombing missions during the Second World War, particularly bombing missions that destroyed cathedrals and churches in Europe. And so he kind of wrote this book as a way of grappling with his past and his guilt for destroying what was beautiful from the past, as well as, I guess, addressing his fears about where the world was heading and kind of trying to give a warning about the dangers that he saw in nuclear weapons. The third part especially, where the society that you've watched over the course of the book work so hard to build themselves back up, is right back in the same place, about to destroy themselves again, was really, really sobering. There's some really hard to read sections about people dealing with the side effects and after effects of a nuclear explosion, and the suffering that would cause, and those sections were very sad and definitely made me feel a little bit sick at times, but it's really a book that is going to stick with me, and one that I am confident that I will reread at some point in the future, just because I think there is so much depth to be drawn from all three timelines. And so, drum roll, we have arrived at number 1. I am about to reveal my number 1 favorite book of 2022, and it's actually, I think, the first book that I started. It's on Goodreads as the third book that I finished in the year, but I think it's the first book that I actually started and finished in 2022. So it has been sitting at the top of my chart since January, and nothing could unthrone it, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This book had a ton of hype to live up to. It is such a well-known classic, and I've had it recommended to me by many, many people, many, many times, singing its praises. So it was one of those books where going in, I knew I was either going to love it or be so disappointed when it didn't live up to my expectations. But thankfully, it not just met my expectations, but exceeded my expectations, and is now like a true forever favorite. It's actually hard to sum up in words my reading experience with this book. I tried to do my reaction to reading Rebecca for the first time video like a number of times. I tried filming it, I tried scripting it, and I really struggled to put into words what exactly made me love this book so much. So I'm going to try to do that here. I don't know how coherent my reasonings are going to be. I thought du Maurier did such a wonderful job of putting yourself into the mind and heart of kind of a shy, awkward young woman who is trying to be an adult and make adult decisions, but is also feeling quite quickly over her head in those situations. I found her to be a very relatable sort of character to how I sometimes felt in my late teens or early 20s. But I think my favorite part about this book is the tension building, which is absolutely superb. Du Maurier keeps building tension and building suspense from the very beginning right up until the final pages of the book, and I found myself stressed, like in the best way I can be stressed by a book, but you just have this sinking feeling that something bad is going to happen from very early on, and you're just watching it unfold in horror. This is maybe almost a spoiler, so if you haven't read Rebecca, you might want to stop watching my video here. But I didn't really realize going in how many elements of Jane Eyre this book would have. It almost felt like a very loose Jane Eyre retelling based on the premise, like what if Jane had married Mr. Rochester at the beginning instead of at the end of Jane Eyre. It kind of felt like that was what du Maurier was playing with. There's a number of plot elements that, for spoiler reasons, I won't get into, but there are a number of plot elements that really make this feel like it was heavily inspired by Jane Eyre, and I found that so fascinating. In the end, I'm still really not sure how I feel about the main relationship between our narrator, our nameless narrator, and Mr. De Winter. It really seemed like he chose her from a place of damage. He liked her because of who she wasn't, not because of who she was. And so that part of the relationship I really didn't like. I didn't really see this as a romance. Actually, again, that's really like a Jane Eyre retelling. Like Jane Eyre, at times, is not a romance. This book, I really didn't feel like I was rooting for the romantic relationship in. And I actually felt quite bad for our nameless narrator because in a way her character arc is almost flattened by the end of the book, because she actually ends the book the same way she began the book, which is living abroad in a hotel as someone's well-paid companion, essentially. So I actually ended up feeling quite bad for her, that I feel like she didn't get a chance to break free in reality. She ends up pretty much trapped in the same situation that she was in at the beginning of the novel, but she thinks that she chose it. But I don't really feel like she did, if that makes sense. This is why I had such a hard time articulating this in my other videos, but that's my feelings about Rebecca and about its plot and how it ends. I definitely know that this is only the start of my journey with Daphne du Maurier. At the time of filming this, I have now also read My Cousin Rachel. I just read My Cousin Rachel this January, in January 2023, and it was also an incredible tension-building 5-star read for me, so I think Daphne du Maurier, I can confidently say, possibly, if you can say confidently after 2 books, but I feel like she's like a new lifetime favorite author where I'm going to enjoy the vast majority of her catalog, and I'm so looking forward to having the opportunity to journey through her bibliography now that I know that I love her writing style so much. So if you haven't read Rebecca, I literally cannot recommend it highly enough. I think anyone would like it. Don't be put off just because it's a classic. I'm busy trying to convince my sister to read it because she really enjoys true crime, and I didn't realize going in how much of this book is like a mystery novel and a true crime novel. It has so many unique elements woven into it. The descriptive writing, absolutely stunning. It starts off in the French Riviera, and those scenes are described so beautifully, and then we end up in this Gothic mansion where you just feel like you can hear the floorboards creaking under your feet as you read it, and I just love the way she writes. And for that reason, Rebecca is my #1 favorite book of 2022, and that wraps up my top 10 favorites. So I hope you enjoyed my rambles about my very favorite books of the year. I read 117 books in 2022, so this is like the top, slightly less than the top 10% of books that I read. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to chat thoughts in the comments, or if you want to share what your favorite read of 2022 is. I'm always looking for new books to add to my TBR that I know are highly recommended to me. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book.